Dear friends, the Egyptian pyramids are without a doubt one of the strangest structures on our planet. They are literally made up entirely of mysteries. If we take a drawing of any of these ancient structures and point our finger at any place, I assure you there will definitely be some completely incomprehensible detail there, the purpose of which Egyptologists have been debating for hundreds of years. And yet I believe it is the long, narrow, sloping corridors that are the main feature and the true calling card of the pyramids, because nothing like them exists anywhere else. Their creation was obviously extremely labor-intensive. After all, it would have been much simpler and quicker to create horizontal corridors. Moreover, horizontal sections of passages are present in many pyramids. This technique was clearly not prohibited, and yet, for some reason, the pyramid builders again and again made corridors at an angle, despite the apparent lack of any rational sense in this. Modern Egyptology, of course, attributes religious significance to them. Supposedly the water of creation flowed through them, carrying the soul of the pharaoh to the stars. However, was this truly their primary purpose? In the previous video, I told you about the tombs of the Third Dynasty, built before the pyramids, which have vertical shafts and very similar sloping corridors. These corridors were obviously intended for human passage, as they had staircases. Furthermore, they could have turns at the top, and after burial, they were blocked in every possible way. The Pyramid of Djoser also has a very similar structure with a central shaft and inclined staircase. And further, these inclined corridors appear in 3 pyramids of the pharaoh Neferefre: Medum, Red, and Bent. So why should we assume that in these pyramids, the purpose of these inclined corridors changed dramatically, and instead of people passing through, the soul of the deceased ruler was supposed to fly there? Apparently, this hypothesis of a religious purpose is connected to the fact that in the larger pyramids, the builders raised the chambers above ground level, and with them, the corridors were also raised. And since Egyptologists see no rational reason for placing the pyramid's exit at such a height, they try to seek answers to all questions in the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. But is this approach truly correct? Let's take a look at the western corridor of the Bent Pyramid, which emerges to the surface at a height of 33 meters. This corridor can tell us a lot thanks to one very important circumstance. It was completely sealed with blocks along almost its entire length. These blocks were adjusted to the size of the corridor cross-section and fixed to the walls with mortar. Some experts explain this by saying that the builders saw a shift in the blocks in the northern corridor and feared a collapse in the western one. However, despite the extremely poor condition of the lower section of the western corridor caused by erosion, there is no structural damage within this corridor. Moreover, it is important to remember that this is far from the only corridor in the Egyptian pyramids that was blocked in this way. We see the same picture in the Pyramid of Khafre. Its lower corridor was blocked in a similar manner. The staircase in the Pyramid of Djoser was also completely blocked with masonry. The inclined corridors of the stairway tombs were also blocked. And in all of these cases, the builders pretended that no entrance existed at all. In the Bent Pyramid, they blocked the western corridor with a casing block, making it invisible from the outside. This entrance was only discovered in the mid-20th century by Ahmed Fakhri, who cleared the western corridor and ascended to its upper end from inside the pyramid. In the Pyramid of Khafre, the entrance to the lower corridor was blocked with paving slabs. And in the Pyramid of Djoser, archaeologists still don't know exactly where the staircase exited. In other words, the builders didn't simply close off all of these sealed corridors. They blocked them up as if they never existed and weren't even part of the design. Why then did they create them? Let's return to the Bent Pyramid. I believe it's there that we can find the answer to this question. Its western corridor has one very important feature. The whole point is that, due to its location, it could not be closed off after construction. To move and install all those blocks at such a height, the lifting system used during the pyramid's construction had to be in place. Otherwise, raising them to such a height would have been simply impossible. Thus, this corridor could only be used during the pyramid's construction, and nothing else. So, perhaps this is the key to understanding the purpose of these inclined corridors. They were primarily used to lift workers during construction, just like the staircases in the tombs and the pyramid of Djoser before them. And if there were two corridors, as in the bent pyramid or the pyramid of Khafre, the builders left one as the main entrance and blocked the other, as if it had never been part of the design. All of this fits very well with my previously proposed hypothesis that much of the pyramid's internal structure served as an important component of the mechanism for lifting building materials during the construction of these structures. This idea immediately explains why ancient architects repeated these inclined corridors again and again, despite the complexity and labor-intensive nature of their construction. And what's very important is that we can trace the use of this technological method back to the construction of the first pyramid, during the construction of the stairway tombs of the pharaohs of the Third Dynasty, and they owe their characteristic structure, with vertical shafts and inclined stairs, to this very technological method. I discussed this in great detail in a previous video. This mechanism was based on the principle of raising blocks by lowering a counterweight. But this counterweight had to constantly return back, because in order to lower it, you first have to raise it up. And the ancient builders had only one counterweight at their disposal that could rise back up by itself: people. Thus, this method required two elements: a vertical shaft for lowering the platform with people, and an inclined corridor through which they could return to the surface. This is why stairway tombs always had a central shaft, in addition to the inclined corridor. And after that, this structure became the prototype for the internal system created in the pyramid of Djoser, and then in the three pyramids of Pharaoh Snefru, Medum, Red, and Bent. Later, to implement this construction technology, huge pits with inclined ramps were excavated, similar to those we see in Abu Rawash and Zawiat El Aryan. I am sure that this method of lifting the blocks was the connecting thread that ran through all the pyramids, and in many ways made them what we know them as today. And now, understanding this, we can follow the path of the ancient builders from pyramid to pyramid, trying to understand the logic of their decisions and provide a rational explanation for the huge number of strange details that have been debated for hundreds of years by Egyptologists and pyramid enthusiasts around the world. Let's begin a detailed analysis of this fascinating topic. In many ways, this video will be a further development, and in some respects a rethinking of the ideas and assumptions I've expressed previously. Now it's time to put the pieces of this puzzle together. Let's return to Saqqara, to the Pyramid of Djoser. Beneath it there is a huge shaft measuring 9 by 9 meters and 27 meters deep. Interestingly, this shaft is far from the only one in Saqqara. At the southern end of the Djoser pyramid complex is the so-called Southern Tomb, which is essentially an identical shaft with exactly the same dimensions. Furthermore, a little further on, near the Pyramid of Unaz, there are 4 more similar shafts. These are the well-known shaft of Tefnakht and 3 shafts commonly referred to as the Persian tombs. Egyptologists date them to the Sadic period, meaning they were built 2,000 years after the Great Pyramids. We will not now question the results of these datings. For us, something else is much more interesting. When compared to these shafts, one extremely important feature of the Djoser pyramid shaft becomes apparent. Unlike all other similar shafts, it has multiple exits at different heights. Why was this done? Many famous researchers who have studied the pyramid of Djoser ask this question in their books. Various theories have been put forward, but everyone acknowledges that there is no definitive answer yet. Let's look at how the staircase leading into the shaft was constructed. It was built in 2 stages. The upper section ran through an open trench. This trench now lies beneath the pyramid and is filled with masonry, yet we can imagine what it looked like, as archaeologists cleared an identical staircase in the southern tomb. For the lower section of the staircase, a large section of bedrock was excavated. Its outline is visible from the shaft in Djoser's pyramid, and we can look at its analog in the southern tomb. It's important to note that at some point, almost the entire staircase was completely blocked off. In the lower part, only a narrow corridor was left at the very top level. Furthermore, lintel beams are visible in the middle of this structure, and beneath them, a blocked passage. Now it is also filled with masonry, but this is a modern work. And in the photographs taken during the restoration, we see that this corridor is simply littered with blocks that fell from above. And the hypothesis under consideration allows us to explain all these facts very simply. To allow platforms carrying people to stop before reaching the bottom of the shaft, the builders needed to be able to disembark at different heights. For this reason, they blocked off the stairway, leaving only a narrow corridor below, and created another corridor above. It's unclear whether the upper gallery, through which tourists now approach the edge of the shaft, was used in a similar manner. Another narrow tunnel runs off to the other side. It is difficult to say now whether they were made to allow people to exit the platforms or whether they served as auxiliary corridors for the workers creating the shaft ceiling. This unique structural element deserves special mention, as Djoser's pyramid is the only pyramid in which such a shaft or pit remains unfilled with blocks. We can only admire the ancient builders who managed to seal the shaft at the base of the pyramid, and did so with such skill that the resulting structure has survived many earthquakes and was only recently reinforced with metal anchors during reconstruction. Experts believe the original ceiling was constructed as follows. Initially, the shaft was completely covered with palm trunks at ground level. One of these trunks still survives, and the remains of others are visible in this photograph. Then, a mortared masonry structure was laid on top, so strong that it withstood vertical loads even after the wooden ceilings collapsed. Over the following millennia, this ceiling was repeatedly reinforced with wooden supports. However, the wood of the original ceiling dates specifically to the reign of Pharaoh Djoser. The question of why the central shaft remained empty is one of the main mysteries of this pyramid, because exactly the same shaft in the southern tomb, located very close to the edge of the complex, was completely filled with blocks, and there are no traces of a similar wooden ceiling there. The photographs show the process of clearing it and the oblong blocks with which it was filled. Based on this fact, many Egyptologists conclude that the shaft beneath Djoser's pyramid was similarly filled after its completion and cleared much later, during the Sayyidite period. However, I believe this hypothesis is extremely unlikely, because if this shaft was not empty, the builders would not have been faced with the task of covering it from above in such an extremely reliable manner. The blocks of the above-ground portion would not have been able to fall down anyway. They would have simply rested on the blocks in the shaft. The filling of the shaft in this case would be the main part of the supporting structure, and clearing it would be simply 100% suicide. Thus, everything points to the fact that the shaft under the pyramid remained empty, and there must have been some good reason for such a decision. I believe this happened because Djoser's pyramid was the first, and its construction was carried out in an impromptu manner. Most likely, its creators initially planned to build only the central mastaba, which at the time of its construction was a completely independent structure and comparable in size to the K1 mastaba in Beit Khalaf. And I believe that if construction had stopped there, the shaft would have been filled in the same way as the southern tomb. However, At some point, the ancient architects realized they could extend the shaft higher and thus continue construction. And once the shaft had risen high above ground level, filling it completely became extremely inconvenient. Therefore, the decision was made to cover it only at the base of the pyramid. And here you might say, okay, the design of Djoser's pyramid, with its central shaft and inclined staircase, is indeed similar to the designs of the stair tombs built before it. But as far as we know, most subsequent pyramids don't have any excavation pits. And, accordingly, it's not entirely clear how the proposed method of lifting the blocks could have worked there. Well, here's where things get interesting. Almost a year ago, I released my first video on the construction of Egyptian pyramids. The main idea of that video was the assumption that both the king's chamber and the queen's chamber in the Pyramid of Khufu were built in pits, similar to those we can see in Abu Rawash and Zawiyat el-Aryan, and the so-called ventilation shafts were laid along the inclined ramps leading upward from these pits, and their perfectly maintained angle of inclination is explained precisely by this. Of course, this assumption seemed very strange to many at the time, since both of these chambers are located much higher than ground level. What kind of pits could there possibly be up there? However, a large number of details point in that direction. I will not now recount the numerous arguments in favor of this assumption. We will return to them and analyze them in detail in the next part. However, here's what's interesting. It turns out that this idea of constructing chambers in pits above ground level is by no means new. In fact, it's generally accepted among pyramid construction experts, with only one caveat. This applies to the small pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties. The photo shows the pyramid of Sahura, the second ruler of the 5th dynasty. Upon entering, we see two walls forming the entrance to a pit. Here's what Keith Hamilton writes about this. These retaining walls are somewhat analogous to the T-shaped pit cut in the rock. Except at Sahura's pyramid, we have a man-made T-shaped pit constructed of superior masonry, raised above ground level. And here is an illustration by renowned Egyptologist Dieter Arnold from his book Building in Egypt. The sketch depicts the installation of the final block of the chamber's roof, built in a very familiar T-shaped pit but created above ground level. Many experts believe that the other pyramids of the pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties were constructed in a similar manner. Unfortunately, these pyramids are very poorly preserved, and in many cases, their excavations are simply impossible to complete due to safety concerns. But the remains of such pits can still be seen here and there. Here, for example, is the unfinished pyramid of Neferefre in Abusir. We can see that the walls of the excavation pit rise above ground level. However, Egyptologists explain the existence of these pits by the fact that it was simply more convenient to build this way. And this construction technique makes it possible to construct interior spaces in parallel with raising the level of the main masonry. Apparently, this is why it never occurred to anyone to extrapolate this idea to the large pyramids of the 4th dynasty. But I am certain that this is precisely the point. All chambers created above ground were built in similar pits with inclined ramps. Moreover, the presence of these ramps, in my opinion, is beyond doubt, since without them, the inclined corridors simply could not have been created. Look at these blocks at the entrance to the ramp of the pit at Abu Rawash. We see exactly the same blocks at the entrance to the Pyramid of Khufu. And here is a trench lined with blocks at the entrance to the Red Pyramid. Note that the builders of the Great Pyramids did their job conscientiously and filled the pits and ramps very carefully, unlike later generations, which is why these pyramids are so well preserved. Incidentally, Dieter Arnold notes exactly the same pattern for the Khufu pyramid, where we also see the outline of a trench at the entrance. And any doubts I had about the validity of this idea vanished after I discovered that, When the pyramids are aligned relative to their apexes, the sloping corridors of the bent pyramid and the so-called ventilation shafts of the Khufu pyramid begin and end at virtually the same levels. Initially, I also assumed that the pyramid builders simply found it more convenient to build this way. That is, they were repeating a familiar technological method they had previously used to create chambers below the surface. And only later did I realize that this entire system of pits with ramps and chambers with inclined corridors was an important part of the technology for lifting blocks during the construction process. Platforms with counterweights, which were people, were lowered into these pits, and these people then climbed back up the inclined ramp. And when the pits began to be filled with blocks, the chambers and inclined corridors took on the same function. That is, the principle of lifting blocks previously used in the first pyramid was completely preserved. And here, I'd like to immediately correct a significant error I made earlier. I assumed that the platforms carrying people could be lowered directly into the chambers themselves. This was certainly not the case. The whole point of these enormous pits is precisely their size, which allowed for the use of several platforms simultaneously. And if in the shaft of the Djoser pyramid there were most likely 4 platforms, then this T-shaped pit was twice as large and allowed the use of 7 platforms. Perhaps this is why it has such an odd shape, and the descending ramp is offset to the side. It occupies the space of only 1 platform, not 2. As the pyramid was being built, the depth of the pit increased, and when it became too deep and the ropes were no longer sufficient, the builders began filling it with blocks, creating a chamber below. And so step by step, building up the top edge of the pit, the chamber itself was created. A corridor rose from the chamber along an inclined ramp, along which the workers returned to the surface to repeat the descent. Just as it happened in the pyramid of Djoser and earlier in the stairway tombs. This is why the builders copied these pits to construct the chambers. After this, the logic behind these pits being above the ground surface became completely clear. In this video, I described the key design principle of the first pyramids, according to which the architects added a new lower section to each successive pyramid relative to the previous one. This is precisely how the shaft beneath the pyramid of Djoser in the Maiden pyramid was already above ground level. Only its small lower section was cut into the bedrock. This lower section is clearly visible in the drawing. And this is how the pits for the chambers of the bent pyramid in the Khufu pyramid rose high up, and the so-called Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber were built in them. In my opinion, this continuity of designs is a very strong argument in favor of the hypothesis under consideration, since such a relationship between the arrangement of chambers in different pyramids could have been dictated solely by technological considerations, and therefore linked to the construction process. And what is very important is that such a technological solution immediately provides an explanation for many of the strange details that we see inside the pyramids and pits. First, let's look at the pit at Abu Rawash. Its top has a distinctive cutout with a leveled bottom. What could this have been for? The rigging equipment located in this place would require some kind of mounting holes or grooves for stops, but there are none. If this pit was simply filled with blocks, then this cutout looks absolutely pointless. But if the builders were extending the pit further, they needed a level surface for laying the blocks, which would act as an extension of the pit. The masonry here would have had to be very strong and level, and accordingly, the first rows would have been laid on a level, prepared surface. I believe that is what we see around this pit. Moreover, if in the side projection the cutout appears strictly horizontal, then in the south-north projection we can observe a clear slope. This was obviously intentional. The builders followed the direction of the limestone strata, leaving a harder layer on top. The rest of the pyramid's base, however, was of no concern to them from this perspective, so it was leveled relative to ground level, as is clearly visible in these photographs. Thus, the builders were concerned about the strength of this particular leveled section along the perimeter of the pit. No other explanation for this technological approach is possible. And we even see the remains of this masonry of large blocks, due to which the pit continued upward. And such blocks are not only around the main part of the pit, but also along the trench, at the bottom of which an inclined ramp is laid. That is, it also continued upward. An analog of this technique, as I already mentioned, can be seen in the pyramids of Sahura and Neferefre. Remains of a similar cutout can be seen along the perimeter of the Zawiat El Aryan pit. This pit has been exposed to the open air for thousands of years, so it is logical that its once smooth edges have been eroded. And it is quite possible that the blocks found by archaeologists during excavations were located just along the perimeter of the pit and were thrown into it when the construction process was stopped. Let's return to the pyramids. If the hypothesis under consideration is correct, then one of the main challenges facing the pyramid builders was to utilize the central shaft or pit for as long as possible. In other words, they had to devise some equivalent to the additional corridors created in the shaft of Djoser's pyramid. If so, it becomes clear why the builders continually sought to increase the height of the false vault, reaching a staggering 17 meters in the lower chamber of the bent pyramid. Moreover, the creators of this pyramid have given us an invaluable clue as to how they used this height. In both chambers of the bent pyramid, superstructures were left, built from small, well-processed blocks. Archaeologists cleared the lower chamber, where the additional structure looked something like this. In the upper chamber, the superstructure remains to this day. And when it was partially dismantled, 2 full floors were discovered at different heights. And this is logical, because the shaft was built up in stages, and accordingly, the chamber was also erected in stages, and these superstructures simply allowed the workers to descend conveniently. Between these 2 stages, up to 3 to 4 months could pass, during which thousands of people descended every day, requiring a heavily reinforced platform and staircase. I am sure that similar superstructures were also present in the chambers of the Red Pyramid, but they were simply removed at the end of construction in the Red Pyramid, while in the Bent Pyramid they were left in place for some reason, and the final finishing of the chambers was not completed. In the same way, in my opinion, the presence of a vertical tunnel leading to a chamber in the Maidam Pyramid can be explained. It also allowed the workers' exit point to be raised, thereby extending the life of the pit, which was created with a step at the bottom. In the Red Pyramid, the same technique was essentially repeated, only the chambers became much larger. And in the Bent Pyramid, the chambers were spaced even further apart vertically, so each chamber required its own sloping corridor. This arrangement of chambers was later carried over to the Khufu Pyramid. Now that we understand both the basic meaning of this entire internal structure and the basic principle of the development of pyramid projects, we can take several more significant steps forward. As is well known, Pharaoh Snefru built 3 pyramids for himself: Maidam, the Bent, and the Red. It is believed that they were designed and built in that order. The Maidam pyramid was certainly the first of them, as it closely resembles the pyramid of Djoser with its sloping accretion layers. But what about the Red and Bent pyramids? Is this true? Let's compare the internal structure of the Maidam pyramid and the Red pyramid. You'll agree, they look very similar from the top view. In both diagrams, we see 2 antechambers and a so-called burial chamber. They are, in fact, similar from the side view as well. However, the antechambers in the Maidam pyramid are very small, just a couple of meters long, and unlike the Red pyramid, there's no false vault above them. Why would they have been needed then? Storing anything in them would have been absolutely impossible simply due to their size. In the Pyramid of Djoser, we see a huge number of additional passages and chambers around the shaft. In the two subsequent unfinished pyramids of the pharaohs, Sekhemkhet and Kaaba, entire galleries with numerous niches were created to store the supplies the buried pharaoh would need in the afterlife. And in the Maiden Pyramid, for the great pharaoh Snefru, the builders limited themselves to just a pair of antechambers measuring 2.5 meters by 1.25 meters. This assumption seems a bit dubious to me. Nevertheless, these two small antechambers were built for a reason. Moreover, the interior layouts of the Maiden and Red pyramids are very similar, and this similarity must obviously have some rational meaning. Let's try to figure it out. If, as we have assumed, the two lower chambers of the Red Pyramid were needed for the workers to exit, then it follows that these two small niches in the Maiden Pyramid must also have worked in a similar way. But why then are they so small? This logical question led me to an interesting assumption. Let's briefly return to the Zawiat El Aryan pit. Those familiar with the plans for this site could not help but notice a very curious detail. The bottom of the pit is lined with huge limestone slabs, but granite blocks are visible on the floor where the planned chamber would be. Thanks to this crucial clue, we can now determine the chamber's dimensions with almost complete accuracy. It turns out that its width is only 3 meters, and this fact is simply astonishing. Why build such a small chamber if you've already dug a huge pit for it? I think I know the answer to this question. If this chamber was also intended to serve as an exit for workers descending from the platforms, then it shouldn't have been blocked from above by these platforms. That's why this chamber is so narrow. In fact, this idea of platforms completely explains the configuration of such pits and the strange arrangement of the chambers within them. Because if these pits were simply needed for the construction of chambers, then it's completely unclear why so much space was left around them. And while this distance on the north and south sides can somehow be attributed to the extension of the gable roof, on the east and west sides, such a large distance from the chamber to the edges of the pit is clearly excessive. But the proposed hypothesis about the lowering of platforms, which required space and were not supposed to block the chamber itself, immediately explains all these details. This is why the antechambers of the Maiden Pyramid are so small. The shaft at the bottom of which they are located was apparently slightly larger than the shaft of Djoser's pyramid. Larger chambers simply couldn't have fit there, given the size of the platforms themselves. So this shaft most likely had a rectangular profile, approximately 10 by 13 meters, with the antechambers located in the center. And if so, what must have been in them during the pyramid's construction? Stairs for people to descend. And do you know what archaeologists found in these small niches? Exactly the same small blocks that were used to construct the superstructures in the chambers of the bent pyramid. Egyptologists, of course, assumed that the builders used the niches to store these blocks. However, in that case, it's not entirely clear what such blocks could have been used for. Therefore, I believe that these were, in fact, the remains of these stairs. And the width of the antechambers, equal to 1.25 meters, was quite sufficient for a comfortable descent. In the Red Pyramid, these small antechambers became fully fledged chambers with a false vault, as the pit itself grew much larger. The builders used the height of this vault as much as possible, and when it narrowed to a width of less than 1.5 meters, and the possibility of descending through it disappeared, they connected the second antechamber with the main chamber located above. This is why this connecting tunnel is elevated so high. Thus, in fact, the internal systems of the Maiden and Red pyramids are identical and differ only in the sizes of the pits, and accordingly, the chambers. Furthermore, the false vault in the chambers of these pyramids is double-sided, In the bent pyramid, however, the chambers are much more widely separated vertically, and we see exactly the same pattern in the pyramid of Khufu. From all of the above, it becomes clear that at least in terms of the design sequence, the red pyramid preceded the bent pyramid. Moreover, in the bent pyramid, the false vault tapers on all four sides. This allowed the chambers to be made even higher than in the red pyramid. However, it appears the builders miscalculated in the upper chamber. The capacity of this opening at the very top proved insufficient due to the narrowing on all sides, and part of the ceiling had to be removed. Overall, I believe the transformations we see in this chamber are very important for understanding what happened in the pyramids during their construction. But a detailed analysis of all the numerous details and nuances simply cannot be contained within the scope of this video, so let's put this fascinating topic aside for later. But I'd still like to share one important point. In the fall of 2022, 3D scanning of the bent pyramid's burial chambers was conducted as part of work on a documentary series. A year later, the results of this scan were published in an article by renowned Egyptologist Franck Monnier, who participated in the study. Here's an illustration from his work. In my opinion, it is clear from this image that this row of blocks was laid in a non-standard way. It even appears wider than its neighbors. That is, the cutting down of the false vault, the results of which we observe, did not take place in a fully constructed chamber, as experts claim, but at a time when it was not yet completed. Therefore, the builders were unable to lay the upper rows as originally intended, resulting in these strange elements in the masonry. Later, due to improper loading, the upper rows cracked and partially collapsed. As confirmation of this, we can observe at the top the untouched lower planes of the blocks, which have very evenly chipped side edges. Thus, I believe that in the upper part of the chamber, we have traces of natural destruction of the vault, and below, the result of manual work. And this picture is in very good agreement with the hypothesis under consideration. Furthermore, the idea of using chambers as workers' exits during construction helps solve another important mystery of the Great Pyramids. Why did the builders always place the exits on the sides of the chambers rather than in the middle? We see a similar technique in all the pyramids of the 4th dynasty. The Maidum pyramid, the Red pyramid, the lower and upper chambers of the Bent pyramid, the Queen's chamber and the King's chamber in the pyramid of Khufu and the pyramid of Khafra. In all of these pyramids, we see this strange placement of the chamber exit. It's important to note that it all began with the Maidum pyramid. Nothing similar is observed in the previous pyramids of the pharaohs, Djoser, Saqqara, and Khaba. Clearly, this highly unusual arrangement of the exits must have some meaning. I believe this meaning is very simple, and it is determined by the functionality of these chambers. This made it easier to place the superstructure and stairs in them. That is, it was not the shape of the superstructure that was determined by the location of the exit, but rather the opposite. The location of the exit from the chamber was thought out taking into account the convenience of workers descending during construction. Forgive me if I've confused you a bit by jumping from one pyramid to another. I simply wanted to demonstrate in one video that the idea of using people as counterweights provides a rational explanation for a huge number of strange details and patterns in the pyramid's internal structure, which until now seemed completely unrelated. The increased number of chambers in the larger pyramids, the inclined corridors that rise above the ground along with the chambers, the connecting passages at great heights, the strange layout of the rooms, and many other mysterious features of the pyramids suddenly make perfect sense. At the same time, I deliberately did not touch on the specific parameters of the system under consideration, and we still have to find answers to many important questions. For example, what was the maximum length of the ropes used, and therefore the maximum depth of the excavation pits? Moreover, it's clear that the pits, located at the very heart of the pyramids, were only the central part of this overall block-lifting mechanism. And for the large pyramids of Djoser and Giza, given their size, they couldn't possibly solve all the problems. Accordingly, there must have been another method for lifting the blocks along the edges of the pyramids. Well, that's precisely the method we'll discuss in the next video. Dear friends, write in the comments what you think about the ideas presented in this video. And of course, if you liked the video, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. You can also support my channel financially. The link is in the description of this video. Thank you very much for your time and attention.